Hello, ladies and gentlemen of On the Line. I'm your host, Jen Gerson, and RIP to my Twitter/X mentions because today I'm talking separatism. I have Greg Jack, Senior Vice President of Ipsos Public Affairs. They've just completed a very detailed new survey on separatism sentiment in both Alberta and Quebec. Of course, this has been in the news of late. We have an active petition to try and force a separation referendum in Alberta, and the Americans are starting to weigh in oh so helpfully. Do most of Albertans actually want to leave Canada? The numbers may actually surprise you, so do stick around and check out this interview on the line. Well, hello, Greg, and thanks for joining me on the line this week.
Yeah, it's great to be with you. Good morning.
Great, fantastic. So I'm talking to you this week because you guys have actually issued a very, very interesting survey on separatism in Alberta and in Quebec, I believe.
Yes.
Now, we know that there have been lots and lots of surveys that have come out that generally show that separatism in Alberta, in particularly, is kind of like between the 20 and 30% space of people surveyed, which is alarmingly high and has been alarmingly high for a very long time. But I think there's something that's quite distinct about your survey, and I think it's worth paying particular attention to. Can you tell us about some of the things that you did that was different from other surveys on this particular file?
Sure. Yeah. So we asked about the baseline support, as all surveys do. We asked people whether or not they would vote yes or no. What we did was a little bit different. Was we then asked those people about some conditions around independence, around separation. Some costs, effectively, whether or not they would still support it if they had to undergo a period of economic, insecurity or downturn, or whether they would still support it if they had to negotiate a new trade agreement with all of their partners, whether they would support it still if it meant that they would have to get a new passport. And so once we applied these conditions, we were able to figure out whether or not people's commitment to separatism in both Quebec and Alberta was really strong, or was it more symbolic. And we actually found that the population really broke into three kind of distinct groups. There were the committed separatists, for whom the cost really didn't matter. They said that they would still want to separate even after hearing at least 4 or 5 of those costs and agreeing, yes, I would still want to separate even if that happened. The other end of that spectrum was the symbolic separatists, and those people, when asked about those costs, they didn't agree with a lot of those statements that they would still want to separate, 0 to 1 of those. And so in those cases, we feel like those people are saying that they want to separate because they're trying to send Ottawa a message, perhaps, or they have some frustrations. They haven't really thought through the costs. Those people also tended to be less engaged overall on politics. And so obviously, as any sort of referendum campaign got underway in Quebec or Alberta or anywhere, that engagement would be expected to go up. And then there's that middle group who we called the conditional separatists. And those people were kind of agreeing with some of them, but not all. They have some conditions that they're willing to separate, and others that they're saying, no, that's a hard line. I wouldn't want to do it if that were to happen.
I'm really happy that you guys actually stress tested some of these questions, because one thing that I consistently get back from separatist crowds on Twitter or social media is they seem to be very defensive about the idea that they're fringe. We're not fringe, we're not fringe, we're not fringe. And then there's a hyperfixation on 30% of the province feels this way, 40% of the province feels this way. I'm normal, you're the fringe. And, I think 20 to 30% isn't fringe. I would agree with that. But the concern that I had with that 20 to 30% when people report on it is that it's a very top line number, and I'd yet to see anybody really delve into what that 30% really believed. Which of these 30% of you actually want to become an independent state? Which one of you are trying to just send a message to Ottawa? And which one of you are actually trying to wheedle our way into an American state? And I think that if you actually start to slice it down like that, what you see isn't 30% of Albertans want to separate out of Canada. What you see here is that 30% of Albertans are really, really, really frustrated, and some portion of those people are committed to separating out of Canada. But the portion of people who are really committed to separating out of Canada are a very small percentage of the population overall.
No, I totally agree with that. And when we did the test, the stress test, as we called it, we saw that strong view drop by half, or almost half. The separatist crowd, and like any crowd, is not homogenous. It varies. There's different slices. There's different reasons that people come at this. I think that one thing that everyone in Alberta and the West can agree on is that there are some grievances that people have had for a long time. You remember, of course, the 1990s, the West Once In, Preston Manning was pushing for Alberta and the West to be more part of Canada. And so there is a group within those people seeking independence that do want out, and they might want to join the States. I not want to use the word fringe, but it's probably smaller than we might be led to believe by some of the social media chatter and media commentary to which you referred to. So, yeah, I agree.
So is it safe to say that probably the number of people in Alberta polled who are truly committed separatists will die on this hill, will leave the province, will vote to leave the province under any condition? It's probably closer to 10% than 30%.
It's probably closer between 10 and 15. I mean,
10 and 15%.
One of the things that we, and one of the caveats around this poll is that this is a hypothetical right now. There's no government in power in either Alberta or Quebec that is actively promoting separation. We might see one in Quebec if the polls hold up, and anything can happen. But once we had a campaign, there would be some arguments for, and there would be some people who would maybe even change their mind after they heard some of this in a more mainstream way, because as I pointed out, we didn't cover all the arguments, and some of these folks are disengaged. So right now, I would say it's a good snapshot in time, 10 to 15%. And it's a good baseline for us to have going forward, and for us to arrange our response proportionally to what's really happening, and try and sift through that noise that we see sometimes from some of these groups in areas you mentioned.
Now, we know that this particular issue has been in the news. Two reasons. Of course, there is now a petition active in Alberta to try and force some kind of separation referendum in Alberta through the Citizens Initiative Act. So that group has 120 days total to get 177,000 physical signatures on a petition in order to make that referendum a possibility. We know right now that it's looking pretty strong for a Parti Québécois win in Quebec. We know that the odds of the PQ forcing a referendum in Quebec in the next year or so, if they win, are very, very high for demographic and political reasons. So I want to compare these two groups here. And then, of course, thirdly, the other thing that's been in the news is that we now have sort of members of the U.S., U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Republican Congressman Andy Ogles now coming out and saying things like, Albertans all want to join America. So first, let's take the first line here. Do Albertans want to join America, Greg?
Well, I wouldn't say that the Secretary's comments reflect the vast majority of Albertans. No, there is a group within our survey that for whom joining the United States would be something they would consider, but it's not even all of the committed separatists. So if you take that group that you talked about earlier, that is sort of I would die on this hill. Some of those people absolutely don't want to join America. So you're talking about taking a pie, slicing that piece of pie into a smaller piece of pie, taking that piece of pie and slicing it into a smaller piece of pie. And then you have the group who A, want to separate, and B, want to join Alberta. It's not something that I would attribute to the mainstream or majority, not even a minority opinion of Albertans. It would be probably less than the 10% that you mentioned who falls into that group.
Right. So this is the support for joining the support for joining America specifically is a sub 10% group of the overall population.
Yes, it's a subgroup of that committed group.
So this group I literally could call fringe, statistically speaking, and I would be fine.
I would call it a very small sample size.
I'm trying to get cover to get away with my Twitter tirades here, Greg. Okay, so let's also compare the separatist group in Alberta and Quebec. How are these groups similar, and how are these groups different from what you can tell from your survey?
I mean, there's a lot of similarities in terms of their level of grievance. I come at this from a different perspective as well, because I've lived both in Alberta for 7 years, and I now live in Quebec. I've experienced both of these points of view. What we found in the survey, when we asked people, okay, you say you want to vote to separate, or you lean that way, why do you feel that way? And we actually found that in Quebec, it was more about the future of the province and how it could prosper outside of Canada. In Alberta, we found it was more grounded in historical grievances or anger. So again, that goes back to the point that I raised earlier. there is a subgroup of these folks who said they would vote in favor of independence who really just want to be heard. In Quebec, that's less the case. What we did find, though, is that the more committed you are, the more you're in that committed group, the more it really is about the future of the province. And so that means that, it's a tricky situation for any government because there's different policy levers they have to pull and different messages that are going to work on different people, just like anything. The other thing we found was that, when we laid out the conditions in Quebec versus Alberta, the conditions were similar, but there were a couple of things that we asked specific to the province. Quebec is more obviously interested in areas around language autonomy. That isn't something that we saw come up in Alberta. And of course, in Alberta, equalization is an issue that we've heard talked about for a long time. There's a chunk of our respondents in the survey in Quebec who feel like equalization is unfair because Quebec is giving more to Canada. And this is a line that we've heard from the separatist groups in Quebec for years.
But that's not true. Like that's just.
Well, it is not true in terms of equalization, no, because there's an actual number you can attach to that. And Quebec received, 13 billion, I think. Mike Holden from the British Business Council of Alberta had a presentation at a conference I was at last week. But the narrative around the federal government not giving Quebec its fair share is a long one, and it depends on how you measure that. So in Alberta, there's that same feeling that perhaps Alberta isn't getting their fair share, but in that case, I think you could make a stronger economic case if you look at equalization that it's based in fact.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting to me. So firstly, what surprises me about that survey is that I would have thought the opposite would have been true. I would have thought that Quebec would have been way more grounded in historical grievances because of the history of English, French colonization and settlement in the country. I thought that would be much more normal, and you would have, an independent Quebec is not. I don't think an independent Quebec is an economic powerhouse. Like that's not where I would go. I would say maybe there's an argument for people who are Quebecois to have like a more insular culture or to have more control over their immigration or their language or their culture. I can understand that argument. But the idea that somehow unshackled from Confederation, Quebec is going to become an economic powerhouse somehow, that is not an argument that I would find convincing. At least it doesn't feel like it's an argument that should be convincing here in Alberta.
Well, I should, caveat that a little bit, that when we asked people about why they wanted to separate, it was that they felt the future of the province or the group was better. And of course, in Quebec, that could mean complete control over the language, complete control over immigration, which is something that has been a big issue in Quebec. Mm-hmm. And the other point I would make is that the issue of Quebec separation has been around for a long time. A lot of the things that were first being asked for in the 1970s and 60s when they started pursuing this project, have been achieved. And so Quebec has, a lot of the powers that they were looking for back when they started asking for this. So those who are left over, who are still wanting to separate, are not doing so for the same reasons as they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. And of course, you have a new generation of people who haven't gone through the two referendums that they had in Quebec and don't remember all of that. And so their reasons, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, these groups are not homogenous. They are very different, and people come at it with different reasons. I would love to dig into some of the demographics of the separatist groups more, but we would need a larger sample, which is why we use this as a baseline to set to establish the methodology and set a baseline, so that if we have to dig into this further and if we start to have a campaign, we can do so with a good methodology established.
Okay, so this is interesting stuff here, because when I hear the Alberta separatists talk, the argument that I hear is overwhelmingly economic, not cultural. There's a little bit of the cultural argument. The issue around immigration to Alberta is starting to pop up. It's becoming more of a thing. But, Albertans are not ethnically different or linguistically different than the rest of Canada. So the argument is overwhelmingly an economic one. To what extent is the separatist argument in Quebec coded around pure laine Quebecois, for lack of a better term, a white national identity, not the, you know what I'm saying? To what extent is this coded around race and culture?
Well, it's hard to definitively say from the numbers that I have. I'd have to dig a little bit deeper to see how these groups differ that way. But I think certainly in Quebec, the question is around language, which is not a factor at all present in Alberta. As you point out in Alberta, the economics tend to be the arguments that we hear most often. But again, that might differ by separatist type and by how engaged a person is. In Quebec, they have a lot more history, whereas I think in Alberta, it's more of a general history of Western alienation. And I come back to the point I made earlier. The project in Alberta up until recently has been the West Wants In. And a lot of people have talked about the MOU signing between Premier Smith and the Prime Minister as a positive thing, showing that there's attention being paid. That sort of thing typically in Quebec doesn't result in the same praise or support. I mean, you saw the Prime Minister gave a speech the other day and was roundly criticized in Quebec media for doing it in a location that signaled the British conquest over Quebec when that was not the message he wanted to send. So the reaction to those things has been quite different. And I think that if the Prime Minister signed an MOU with Quebec, similar to the one he signed with Alberta, you would see the separatist groups reacting a little bit differently depending on what was in it.
Well, yeah, and this is also very interesting as well because that Alberta would be more fixated on historical grievances in the future. I would imagine that the separatists would be much more fixated on the idea of Alberta as being this powerhouse economic wonder kid in North America if it were able to be unshackled from America. I think that there's flaws to that economic reasoning, but I think there's at least some grounds for it given Alberta's resource wealth, right? And entrepreneurialism and all kinds of things. I think Alberta has a lot of things going for it economically. Mm-hmm. I don't know how well a lot of those economic assumptions hold if you're talking about, a landlocked state that is now at odds with everything around it. But right. I'm not convinced that their economic reasoning is as sound as they claim it is. But at least there's some ground for it there. But for a lot of the separatists to instead be grounded in historical grievances as opposed to a future forward-looking role really does surprise me. I don't know if you can speak to that.
Yeah, no, I did mention earlier that the more committed people are to the project of separation, the more likely they were to fall into that future bucket. And so the committed separatists in Alberta certainly are looking at it from that perspective. Perhaps the symbolic ones haven't thought too much about it, and they're thinking it could be leveraged to increase Alberta's position with Ottawa or that sort of thing. But you can also read too much into people's reasons sometimes because the logic on some of these arguments isn't always as strong as it could be. One of the things we looked at, pointing to looking at that wealth that Alberta has, and not particularly the resource and oil wealth. I asked people, do you think that if Alberta were to separate, the U.S. would have no choice but to negotiate a favorable agreement with us because they need our resources? And we did see stronger views around that among separatists. So they think that they have some leverage here on that front. Just like, Quebecers might think they have a bit of leverage in terms of slicing the country in half or some of the cultural stuff. I can't say with any certainty what would really happen in that scenario, but I think that if we look at the behavior of the United States recently and the comments made by the Treasury Secretary, that leverage could go any number of ways. And the president hasn't necessarily approached making these sorts of deals as one where everybody in the end benefits, whatever that deal is. So this idea that, if for some of these separatists, again, a very small group within a small group, that they could then form an independent Alberta and then say to the states, well, we're going to make a deal for our resources and you're going to give us favorable terms. I don't think we can say with certainty that that's what would happen.
Well, in a scenario where Alberta votes to leave Canada and is now isolated on all sides, what leverage do you think you have to negotiate better terms with the United States, which at this point as a country would be 100 times larger than you by population? Yes. Even as a state, I mean, this is the thing that I struggle with a lot of the separatist types, and I struggle with this with a lot of Canadians too, who don't seem to understand the scale of America versus Alberta or versus even Canada. Mm-hmm. Alberta is Oklahoma. You know what I mean? Yeah. How successful do you think Oklahoma is at getting what it wants out of Washington? And not only are you the size of Oklahoma, But, you've now also at this point demonstrated that you're not even a loyal Oklahoma because you've separated from your original country. So
Yeah.
how much leverage do you think you have exactly? Also, America is not quite energy independent, but the shale revolution has done wonders in terms of allowing America to move more and more toward energy independence.
Hmm.
They don't need our resources. I'm not saying that going off Canadian resources would be easy or without cost,
Hmm.
but they've got lots of resources.
And
So like the leverage that Albertans think they have here relative to here's the thing that gets me. If you think you can, if you think that you have been historically aggrieved and put upon and you're a vassal state when you're 12% of the population in Canada, how historically, how effectively do you really think you're going to be able to negotiate or navigate when you're 1.2% of the population in America? I don't understand where the logic comes through that you think you're going to have a better deal in Ottawa that you're going to than you have you're going to have a better deal in Washington than you have in Ottawa, even accepting that some of these grievances are legitimate,
That's
right?
absolutely true. And this is what happens with these things. They can pick up a mind of their own, and as I mentioned, emotion can really drive it. We look at Brexit, which started out one way and ended another way, and a lot of the points that were made around Brexit being maybe not the best deal for the UK, were perhaps ignored during the actual campaign, and then some of these costs have actually come true. I think that the emotional idea of being able to stand up and negotiate on behalf of the province and offer something that the Americans want, because you're right, the world is obviously thirsty for good reliable energy, and Alberta has that in abundance.
Mm-hmm.
But we've seen the president act in ways where he's trying to acquire more control over that in other ways. Jen, you and I have talked about Venezuela and some of the commentary going around that all of a sudden Venezuela is going to displace Canadian oil. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but over a long period of time, that does become something that is possible. Anything can happen over a period of 10 to 20 years. And so the leverage Alberta has right now, with our energy and the fact that to your point, it's a landlocked region. The rest of the world is also looking at this and acting in its own interests as well. And so it's maybe not as strong an argument as it might seem on the surface, but it is emotionally driven and probably, one that we're going to hear more of in the coming weeks and months if this discussion picks up.
So this is an emotionally driven argument. People are driven by their feelings on this. So I understand how people get to a place where they're so frustrated with Ottawa or so frustrated with feeling out of step with central Canada
Mm-hmm.
that they're willing to consider or entertain drastic actions. Emotionally, I understand how you get there. I do. What from your research is suggesting might be the effective counter lever? By that, I mean, how do you break through that emotional OODA loop
Mm-hmm.
and get people to say, okay, but maybe there are risks here that I need to consider rationally and play those rational risks off of my feelings on this matter. What are some of the things that you think might pierce that thinking pattern?
Well, there's a variety of things that I think have to happen for people to really think about these things in a rational way. And the first has to be that they engage on a personal level. I can tell you just on general research on pretty much anything, if people don't feel like they have a personal stake in something, then it's very difficult to persuade them to think about it from a rational point of view. And if we all have a personal stake in the success of Canada, I think that Albertans should feel they have a personal stake in Canada, and Canadians should feel they have a personal stake in Alberta. And we saw that during the 1995 Quebec referendum, that there was a lot of Canadians who were saying, we value you, don't leave. But arguments around GDP and jobs and all of that, they don't tend to penetrate even as clear as the numbers are, because they're numbers they're really hard to internalize. The Prime Minister has done a few things that I think are positive. He has found a way to work with United Conservative Premier and sign an agreement that everybody seems to agree on the face of it is a positive thing. The devil's going to be in the details. And one of the things that we looked at and have looked at on a number of fronts is how much action is going to have to be seen for numbers to move, because a criticism that has been had in this country, and you at the line have talked about it, and we've seen it in our research, is that we've had governments over the last several years that have made a lot of promises but haven't delivered a lot of results. The Prime Minister's speech in Davos, which was widely praised, even by the leader of the opposition, the one thing that criticism that I think I've heard most is, okay, that's great, but what are we going to do next? I think that will start to move people, because the people are now paying attention. I think we've woken up as a country to a lot of realities in the world. I think the Prime Minister reflected, and we wrote a piece on this, reflected Canadians' views about where we are in the world now. There's still a desire for Canada to be a leader, but there's a bit more realpolitik behind that. And so you can use the same arguments to combat some of this fear of separation sentiment in both Quebec and Alberta by demonstrating some real value and demonstrating that seat at the table that these provinces are really demanding. And I should point out to your readers as well, or your listeners, the separatist sentiment we looked at was purely in Alberta. We didn't have a large enough sample to really get into it in Saskatchewan, but there is a little bit of bleed over. There's a portion of people in Saskatchewan who would go, I think, or want to go with Alberta. You kind of go back to the Buffalo Project of the early 1900s. So that's something as well that we have to think about. These two provinces are sort of in this together in terms of the debate and what people there think. So governments have to respond to those concerns in Saskatchewan as well.
So the line between Alberta and Saskatchewan has always been rather notoriously arbitrary. In fact, so arbitrary that there is a town called Lloydminster that is actually split between the two provinces. Right?
Yes, I know. And if you go to school there, I think you end up with the Saskatchewan school system if you live in Alberta. It gets very confusing.
Yeah, totally. One of my great fears about what happens if the current separatists petition is successful. And by the way, the general received wisdom here in Alberta right now is that the current petitions that are happening, that are being led by the crop of separatists, is probably not likely to be successful for a lot of really practical reasons. Namely, that a lot of Alberta's separatists seems to be concentrated in rural areas. It's really, really, really hard to canvass rural areas. It just takes more time to get between places. When you compare this to the Forever Canadian petition that happened earlier this year, earlier last year, led by former Deputy Premier Thomas Lukaszuk, overwhelmingly, many more of those people were in cities, highly concentrated. You could set up, signing booths, and many hundreds or thousands of people would come. To be fair, the separatists have a much harder row to hoe in order to get half as many names on their particular referendum petition. I think that received wisdom could be challenged. I am not as confident as many people seem to be that this referendum is going to go nowhere. One of my fears here is that these guys actually are going to get 177,000 names on their signature. And if that happens, I don't know that there's a plan for what next. Right. So I'll start with the question that is obvious. I mean, can you glean from the numbers that you have, can the separatists get to 177,000 signatures on a petition? Are the numbers there for them?
Well, I mean, you make some great points about the logistics of it. Are there 177,000 people in our, if you extrapolate our survey to the province that would vote yes? Yes, there are. But it's one thing to say on a survey that you would vote yes, and it's another thing to put your name on a petition. The other thing I think that, going back to a point I made earlier, there's no government in Alberta that is advocating for this right now in an obvious, objective way. I mean, I think the government is listening to this group because they feel that they have grievances that should be listened to, and they're open to considering their views. It's possible, given the Premier's approach, that there's a referendum question among many other referendum questions on a variety of issues, sort of like you see in California with their propositions.
Because California is brilliantly governed. Let's definitely take that model and run with it. More referenda. That's great. Super.
Yeah. But in Quebec, the risk of a government who is taking power on a promise to do this and throwing the power of the state behind a question is very different than we have to gather a number of signatures and then go through these hoops before this actually happens. And
Right.
so I think that based on the survey, it is possible to get that number of people who would want to be asked the question. But whether or not it's logistically feasible, all of the caveats that you point out are good ones. Others will have different responses around how they might do that. But there's also probably, I would assume, a portion of people who feel the question should be put to the people. And we should be asked the question, but not because they want to vote yes, but because they want to have a say and affirm their view in Canada. And so they might want to have that question posed, even if they were going to vote no. I don't have any polling to back that up, but it's possible that there's people who feel that the question should be asked because we should be asking the question.
Well, I
If
mean,
only to put to rest the conversation.
as we all know, there are never any long-term political or economic questions from just asking a question officially about whether or not we should blow up the country. So great, super. What could possibly go wrong? The other question I have is, one of my great fears here is that in the admittedly low but not zero probability scenario where you have the Alberta referendum go through and this moves forward to an actual separation referendum. That's right. Where you have the Alberta petition roll through and this rolls through into an Alberta separation referendum. One of my concerns here is that you're going to see the rest of Canada treat Alberta differently than Quebec. And by that, I mean where you had the sponsorship scandal and Ontario and a lot of places in the country, go bend over backwards to make Quebec feel like, no, we want you. You're a valuable member of our community. We're still into you. I think that there's going to be a different kind of reaction if Alberta moves forward to the referendum. It's going to be more of a screw you, leave then kind of energy. And I have a fear that will amp up the resentment, right? That's going to amp up the resentment that a lot of Albertans feel. And even Albertans who are either on the fence or even disinclined to vote are going to see a lot of material coming out of central Canada telling them to get the fuck out. And they're going to say, well, fine, I guess we're not a part of your polity anymore. I guess we'll just leave. And I think that is going to become, if there is a really stark contrast between how people respond to Quebec separatism versus Alberta separatism, that will be seen and felt very intensely by people in Alberta.
Yeah, I think that would be a possibility. And there is right now in both provinces, there's no obvious person or group who is speaking on the other side. The Quebec Liberal Party, as you know, is in some disarray. Speaking of scandals, their leader had to resign, and they're looking for a new one. And in Alberta, I suppose the no side would be the leader of the NDP and perhaps Premier Smith herself, depending on where the government falls on this. One of the things that I think
the fact that we don't know is also a bit of a problem now, isn't it?
One of the things I would say too is, we have, there are things that can bring these two seemingly different issues of Quebec separatism and Alberta separatism together. And that is some sort of articulation of the answer to the question, why are we a country? And this is something we've grappled with, at Ipsos, and I've talked to Matt about, and I think I've talked to you about as well at times. We don't have necessarily a really, really clear answer to that question right now. The answer to the question has always been because we're not America.
And we're increasingly not America.
Yeah, and we are. And we can say that there is some evidence that that's further the case now. The answer to that question beyond that has been elusive. We've sometimes said it's because we're peacekeepers in the world, or because we have public Medicare, to which I always respond that public Medicare is a policy decision. The value that you want to protect there is people having access to healthcare if they need it, whether it's delivered by the private sector, public sector, or some variation, are policy decisions. And without advocating for one or the other, because there's certainly a coherent argument for a fully public system, but the outcome, the value is what you're after. So I think that, going back to your question earlier, what can happen? I think that we need to have some sort of articulation in this country about why we're Canadian that brings together the people in Quebec, the people in Alberta, and we have people in Newfoundland who have a very recent history with our Confederation. There's certainly some folks alive today who remember Newfoundland not as part of Canada. as the last province to join Confederation. And then there's folks in British Columbia probably who have different views, very high Asian immigrant population. So we need to articulate that vision or whatever it is of why it is that we are a country and what brings us together. I don't have any magic answer for that. That's a challenge for all of the politicians and public speakers who we're talking about. And we have voices for Alberta within the federal government beyond the Prime Minister, who's from Edmonton or has ties to Edmonton. Corey Hogan is an MP in Calgary who's a voice for Alberta. You know, in Quebec, Melanie Joly, of course, and the Finance Minister Champagne are both from there. But I don't know that these are the voices that are going to articulate this. So, you know, in some cases, they've been around for a long time. But I agree with you that there needs to be a proportionate response to this. And we need to, as a country, think about this holistically and not treat Quebec one way and treat Alberta the other. That is the very sort of thing I think that has led to some of this concern and alienation feeling that we're seeing out west.
How could we expect a success or failure of one separatist movement in one province to affect the other? Because one of the other sort of scenarios that I'm kind of concerned about is, okay, let's just say for the sake of argument that Quebec's the Parti Québécois gets elected in Quebec. They successfully run through. They have a successful referendum, or even a borderline successful referendum. Does that force the rest of the country, including Quebec, including Alberta, to go, whoa, wait a minute, this was all fun and games when we were, talking shit on Twitter, but we're now talking about blowing up the country with a hostile neighbor. We're going to buckle down into our Canadianness? Or does that have the opposite effect? Is seeing for example, a nearly successful or successful referendum in Quebec have the impact of communicating to the rest of the country that there is no confederation here, there is no country here, it's everyone for themselves, so you might as well just take what you can get and run? Like, I don't know how, we've had referendum in the past in Quebec, of course, but we've never had two simultaneous referenda happening at the same time. And I think that is a possibility. That is a non-zero possibility for the next year, next 18 months. So how does the success or failure in one region affect the other, if at all?
That's a great question. And I think that a little bit of column A and a little column B. You would have some people who saw this as, oh my gosh, this is really happening. When I talked about it before, I didn't really mean it. And you'd have some people who would say, well, this is clearly evidence that, we're not a country and we need to start to rethink this. It would depend on the sequence of events and when they happened. I don't think that we as a country have contemplated the day after a successful referendum in several years. What we contemplated in 1995, or what happened in 1995 after the narrow yes win or no win, and then 1998's Clarity Act, is a very different world than we have today. Logistically speaking, what happens hasn't really been thought through entirely. And then there's that elephant in the room, which is the United States and how they're going to react. And it is clear, based on previous comments that have been made in the last week, that they are going to react and take a point of view, which, some would argue they shouldn't be. They should be leaving the affairs of Canada to Canada. And I would be one of those people. But that's not the case. They clearly have signaled they're going to take a point of view on this. And so that's going to be something to consider as well. So, one of the things I should say about our poll, it is, number one, not predicting a result. But if the result was to come out the way that we are showing in our polls, it's still only 3 in 10. That's not enough to force a separation. What is a fear, I think, that has been articulated by Thomas Homer Dixon in the Globe and others, is that the some actors in the U.S. or other places, or even here, suggest that no, the real result is 5 in 10. The vote wasn't fair. People's voices were not heard, and then puts the entire result into question. And I did read the dispatch yesterday about foreign interference and the call by you and Matt for us to really think seriously about this and ensure that our electoral processes have bulletproof integrity. Because if we have one of these votes, the last thing we want is for it to happen, and then people question whether or not it is accurately reflecting the will of the people. It needs to be a bulletproof process, and so that's something I think that could help mitigate some of the possible problems that you mentioned. If one jurisdiction goes one way, what's the other jurisdiction going to do?
So if I'm hearing from the results from your survey, one of the takeaways that I have if I'm pro Canada, and I am pro Canada, is that we need to be giving people a very realistic understanding of what the risks and downsides of this path are. It's one thing to sort of sign a petition or even make a vote when you think this is just going to be a giant FU to Ottawa, but when you start talking about, okay, but what if you lost your mobility rights? What if you couldn't travel or work freely in non-Albertan spaces? What if you had to get a different passport? What if there is no guarantee on currency effects? Like, you know what I mean? Like, what dollar are you using? Are you using the Canadian dollar? Are you using the American dollar? Or are you using the Alberta dollar? And by the way, no one can guarantee what your current savings are going to look like after we switch over to the new currency. If people start asking some of those questions, probably you're still looking at 10 to 15% of Albertans who are still going to lock down, but cooler and calmer, more rational heads may prevail when they start weighing through risks and downsides. So there's that. But if I'm an American and I'm trying to sway people toward the maximum chaos outcome, what kind of messages am I throwing into the market to try and convince people to vote against Canada?
Well, I think we heard some of them from the Treasury Secretary. And I don't know if you saw that the president's son, Barron, now has a social media account and is tweeting.
Oh, good. Wonderful.
And he was suggesting in one of his tweets last week that, I know they're not tweets anymore, but whatever they're called, X's, if Albertans want freedom, then they can always choose America. And so I think we will hear some messaging around freedom, which depending on your definition, I don't think we're necessarily seeing evidence of that being exemplified in the United States right now. But that is some of the messaging I might expect from people who are looking to sow chaos. I also think that there would be some messaging around the hemispheric protection, dominance, and security that the president has talked about, that you're only safe if you join the United States. Hypothetically, an independent Alberta, there's a referendum and there's a result that says Alberta is independent, the U.S. might say something like, okay, now you have a choice to make. We're going to protect you or we're not. And if we're going to protect you, then you're now part of us.
On our terms. And guess what? Yeah, on our terms, guess what? You're Puerto Rico and you have no representation and blah, 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 blah. I find that the freedom argument is an interesting one because it placed, and I get this from a lot of people on social media. They say, well, you were talking about Canada becoming a vassal state to America. Alberta is already a vassal state. And I think that is so profoundly misguided. The idea that you're not free in Canada because there's an unfair equalization formula between Alberta and Quebec is where I think this argument gets totally detached from reality. I'm one of these people who I'm just like, yeah, no, I agree that the current equalization formula is unfair. And Alberta does pay more into the system than it gets back. The reason why we pay more into the system than we get back is because we're richer than everyone else. I don't understand how you're aligning that reality to this idea that we're a disadvantaged victim class, because we're not. You can disagree with a policy proposal. You can disagree with a tanker ban. You can disagree with, the last 15 years of stupid pipeline politics. You can disagree with equalization. But these are policy disagreements. They're not existential challenges to freedom. And if you really feel like, Ontarians are an oppressor class, you have full mobility rights. You can literally pick up stakes and go there and become the oppressor class if you want. There's nothing stopping you.
Yeah.
So I don't get where the idea that we're an unfree or oppressed people comes in based on the policy disagreements that we're suffering. And I feel like if I were an American, I'd be really trying to conflate policy disagreement with oppression and freedom. You know what I mean? Like that would be the way I would be going about trying to convince Albertans to go. You'll never be free in Canada. So come to an America where you'll be less free because we're not going to give you the vote. We're not going to give you representation. We're going to turn you into Puerto Rico del Norte. And once you're isolated from the rest of Canada, you're a landlocked state and your oil's ours at our terms because you've got nowhere else to go. Good job, everyone.
Nobody has talked about on all the 51st state stuff. Nobody's really asked the question, okay, do Canadians get senators, members of the House of Representative votes? What do they get? I've heard some arguments early on that said if you brought Canada in as the 51st state and you did it proportionally, oh boy, you've just added a bunch of Democrats to the House. But nobody has really glommed on to whether or not there would even be representative voting. So, I mean, that's a really good point. And the question about how you define your freedom is a good one. If you think back to the convoy and some of the arguments around freedom that were made, it was freedom, government depriving you of freedom to do something. But it ignored the deprivation of freedom of those for whom you were affecting, right? John Stuart Mill always said, my freedom to swing my arm ends when it hits somebody else. And I think that some of the freedom that we're hearing from the states is not necessarily about the true definition of being able to do and live more freely in the way that they might be using the term. I think it's more around being free of governments that are doing things that are seen to be interventionist or maybe not in line with true freedom, whatever that is.
Yeah, well, nothing says freedom like ice, I guess. Really looking forward to that in Calgary. Anyway, Greg, this has been a wonderful chat. I've really appreciated your time. If there's more data that comes out on the separatism file, I really appreciate it. And once again, I just really appreciate the fact that you guys really sliced down and got beyond that top line 20-30%. I think when a lot of Canadians see like 30% of Albertans want to separate from Canada, that's a very alarming number, as it ought to be, and it ought to be considered. But I think it's also worth being somewhat critical of that number as well and asking what does that actually mean and who's supporting what exactly. The other thing I just want to say is, just judging from the data that you're looking at, are we in the media giving too much attention to this?
Well, certainly the last weekend, there were a lot of photos of the lineups to sign this petition and everything. I mean, obviously that's news and the media is going to pay attention to it. What I would hope the media would do is to contextualize it, just like we are here. 30% is a large number, and I think you're correct. We're correct to say this is not a non-issue. We're not saying that this is not a thing. What we are saying is that that 30% or whatever the number is going to be broken down into different types of people. And when you do that and you start to unpeel the onion a little bit, you'll find that it's a little bit more complicated and nuanced than 30% of Albertans want out or want to join the states. Yeah. That's far too simple a statement to make about such a complicated issue. So thank you to the line for really digging into this and trying to have that conversation, because that's what we need, is a conversation about what these things are and how we can respond.
Right. Thanks, Greg. And as said, I know you guys are going to continue to be doing more tracking on this particular file, so I'm sure we'll have you back on again to talk about those numbers and what they actually mean.
Awesome.
So thank you for joining me. No worries. Thanks for joining us and online. And again, do check us out, www.readtheline.ca.